She didn't flinch when her mother's hand connected with her cheek in front of the entire town. She had stopped flinching years ago. But the cowboy watching from across the dusty street, the one nobody spoke to, the one nobody dared approach, he flinched. And something behind his eyes went very, very still. If this story already has your heart, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The summer of 1884 arrived in Harrow Creek like a slow-fire dry heat rolling down from the mountains, baking the earth until the ground cracked and the well water tasted like dust. It was the kind of summer that made people mean. Or maybe the people of Harrow Creek were always mean, and the heat just gave them permission to show it. Nora Calloway was 19 years old, and she had been carrying permission slips for other people's cruelty her entire life. She stood outside Whitfield's general store on the morning of July 3rd, holding a basket of mending she had completed before sunrise. Her fingers were raw. The inside of her left thumb had a deep needle groove worn into it permanent. Now the doctor had told her mother 2 winters ago, when Nora's mother had brought her in, not out of concern, but because she wanted to know if the damage would slow down the girl's productivity. The doctor had looked at Ruth Calloway for a long moment before answering. Ruth Calloway did not notice that look. Ruth Calloway did not notice most things that were not directly useful to her. "You're late," Ruth said, stepping out of the store behind Nora. She was a tall woman, lean in the way that came not from hardship, but from a particular kind of self-denial she wore as virtue. Her hair was pinned so tightly, it pulled the corners of her eyes. "Mr. Whitfield needed that mending by dawn. I delivered it at dawn," Nora said. "He wasn't open yet." "Don't argue with me." "I'm not arguing. I'm explaining." Ruth's hand moved before Nora finished the sentence. The crack of it echoed off the storefront. A woman across the street stopped walking. 2 men on the porch of the feed store looked up, then looked away. A boy of about 12 stared openly until his father put a hand on his shoulder and steered him inside. Nora's head turned with the blow. She did not raise her hand to her cheek. She did not cry. She straightened and looked forward at the space between the buildings at the mountain line, visible beyond the edge of town, blue and distant and clean against the white summer sky. She had learned to find something still to look at. "You will not embarrass me in front of this town," Ruth said quietly. The quiet was worse than shouting. "You will do what you are told when you are told without commentary. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." "Pick up that basket. We're going to the Hargrove house. Mrs. Hargrove needs the summer linens turned and pressed before her guests arrive Thursday." Nora picked up the basket. She followed her mother down the main street of Harrow Creek, the way she had followed her every day of her life, 3 steps behind, eyes forward, making herself small enough that the town could look through her if it wanted to. Most of the time, it wanted to. The Calloway women had come to Harrow Creek 6 years ago after Nora's father died, owing money to people in 3 different counties. Ruth had packed what remained and moved them west with the particular energy of a woman determined to rewrite a story she had already lost. She had not rewritten it. She had simply found a new town in which to be disappointed. What Ruth Calloway had lost in the East, a husband who left debts, a house that was taken, a social standing she had spent 20 years building, she had decided to recover through Nora. Through the labor of Nora's hands and the management of Nora's life, Ruth constructed a careful system of income, mending, pressing, washing, cooking for hire, delivered always on time, always to standard, because Ruth understood that reputation was currency, and she intended to spend Nora in exchange for it. What Ruth did not factor in was that Nora was beginning to develop opinions. They were quiet opinions. Nora had learned that loud opinions cost too much. But they were there, building like pressure behind a sealed door, and sometimes in the mornings before her mother woke, or in the last minutes before sleep, Nora let herself have them. The opinion she had most often and kept most carefully was this: she was not her mother's property. She had not yet figured out what to do with that opinion, but she had it. The Hargrove house sat at the far end of the main street, 3 stories of painted white timber that Mrs. Hargrove polished with the same energy she applied to her social opinions constantly, and without any particular regard for the feelings of those who had to look at it. Mrs. Ida Hargrove was 61 years old and had been wealthy for 40 of those years, which meant she had been insufferable for at least that long. She received Ruth and Nora in the front parlor, the way she received all service people, seated not standing with the particular stillness of a woman who wanted you to understand that your arrival had interrupted something more important. "You're here about the linens," she said. Not a question. A categorization. "Yes, Mrs. Hargrove," Ruth said. "Nora will begin immediately." Mrs. Hargrove's gaze moved to Nora with the careful inspection of someone assessing the condition of a delivered package. What happened to her face? There was a pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "She walked into the door of the barn this morning," Ruth said. "Careless girl." Mrs. Hargrove looked at Nora. Nora looked at the wall behind Mrs. Hargrove's right ear. Said Mrs. Hargrove, and returned to her correspondence. Nora followed the housekeeper upstairs to the linen closet. She worked for 3 hours in the pressing room off the upper hall, the iron heated on a small stove, the steam rising in the July heat, until her dress was soaked through, and her hair had escaped every pin she'd pushed into it. She did not mind the work. The work was something she understood. The work was the one place where the world had clear rules: you do it right, or you do it again. There was no wondering what she'd done wrong. There was no scanning a face for warning signs. There was just the cloth, and the heat, and the clean, flat result. She was halfway through the summer quilt, a heavy thing, expensive fabric, small even stitches along every seam that spoke of someone else's careful labor, when she heard the voices downstairs. Male voices. One of them, Mrs. Hargrove's son Fletcher, whom Nora had learned to avoid in the way she had learned to avoid all men who smiled too slowly. The other voice she didn't recognize. Low. Steady. The kind of voice that didn't need to be loud, because it had apparently never needed volume to be heard. She went back to her iron. Fletcher Hargrove appeared in the doorway of the pressing room 20 minutes later. He was 32, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes not from accomplishment, but from the certain knowledge that consequences were things that happened to other people. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and watched Nora work. She knew he was there. She didn't look up. "Hot in here," he said. "Yes, sir. You've been at it a while." He pushed off the doorframe and took 2 steps into the room. The room was not large. "Mother says your mama's a hard one." "I wouldn't say so, sir." "No." He moved closer. "What would you say?" Nora set the iron carefully on its trivet. She straightened and looked at him directly, which she had learned was sometimes better than not looking. It made certain men uncertain, made them recalibrate. Fletcher Hargrove was not that kind of man. "I'd say I have a good deal left to finish," she said. "If you'll excuse me." "I will not," he said pleasantly, the way people say things when they're enjoying themselves at someone else's expense. "Not just yet. I've been hearing about you, Nora Calloway. Hearing you're a hard worker. Hearing you're very—" He paused with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Obedient." The word landed wrong, the way it was meant to. "I need to finish the pressing," Nora said. "My mother can wait." "Then your mother's linens can wait. I have a schedule, Mr. Hargrove." Something shifted in his expression. The pleasantness thinned. He reached out and took hold of her wrist. Not hard. Not yet. But with the certainty of someone who had never once been told no and been believed. "I think," he said, "you've spent enough time worrying about other people's schedules." Nora pulled. He held. "Let go," she said. "In a minute. Let go of me." His grip tightened. And then there was a sound from the doorway. Not a voice, just a presence, a shift in the air, the way a room changes when something large and entirely certain of itself enters it. "I believe," said the low, steady voice she'd heard downstairs, "the lady asked you to let go." Fletcher turned slowly. In the doorway, stood a man Nora had never seen before. He was tall, not just tall, but built in the way of men who worked land that pushed back all shoulder and forearm, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was more dangerous than movement. He wore a brown leather vest over a collarless cotton shirt, dark trousers, boots that had covered serious miles. His hat was in his hand. His hair was dark, slightly long, pushed back from a face that had spent years in weather. There was a beard close cut, and eyes brown. She saw dark brown that were currently settled on Fletcher Hargrove, with the focused calm of a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "This is a private conversation," Fletcher said. "I reckon not," the man said. "Not if one of the people having it doesn't want to be having it." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "Do you know who I am?" "I know whose house this is," the man said, "which means I know your mother is downstairs, and I know she's particular about her reputation. And I know that what you've got your hand on right now is someone who came to this house to do a job." He paused. "So I'll ask you once more to let go, and we can all go about our afternoon." A silence. Fletcher released her wrist. He did it slowly, with the particular care of a man trying to make the release look like a choice rather than a retreat. He straightened his coat. He looked at the man in the doorway with an expression that was trying very hard to be contempt and landing somewhere closer to calculation. "I don't know you," Fletcher said. "Ethan Walker," the man said. He didn't offer a hand. "I came about the property line on the north pasture. Your mother said I'd find you up here." Fletcher looked at Nora. Nora looked at the iron. "We'll speak about the property line," Fletcher said, in a voice that had remembered how to be pleasant, downstairs. He walked out. The man Ethan Walker did not move from the doorway immediately. He glanced at Nora. Just a glance, brief and without drama, checking in the way you check that something that was tipping has righted itself. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, and then he was gone. Nora stood for a moment in the hot pressing room, looking at the doorway he'd left empty. Then she picked up the iron. She didn't see him again that afternoon. She finished the linens, folded them the way Mrs. Hargrove required, each fold exactly parallel, each edge aligned, and carried the stack to the linen chest in the upper hall. She went back for the summer quilt, pressed it flat, hung it to cool. She went through the rest of the list: the guest room curtains, the parlor table, runners, a set of pillowcases that had been stored since winter and needed freshening. She did all of it without going near the main staircase again. When she came downstairs at last, Ruth was in the front hallway speaking with Mrs. Hargrove, and the house had no one else in it. "She did acceptable work," Mrs. Hargrove was saying, in the tone of a woman who considered acceptable a significant compliment. "She always does," Ruth said. Mrs. Hargrove pressed coins into Ruth's hand without looking at them. Ruth accepted them without counting them in front of her, which was a dignity Ruth preserved for herself, even when extending none to anyone else. They walked back through town in the long light of late afternoon. Ruth said nothing. Nora said nothing. They passed the Whitfield store, the post office, the barber shop, the small church at the edge of the main street. Nora looked at the mountain line again. The mountains were orange now in the low light, the snow on the highest peaks going pink. Distance, she thought. That was the thing about mountains. They were always there, always themselves, entirely indifferent to what was happening down in the valley. She found that comforting in a way she had never explained to anyone. 3 days later, she saw Ethan Walker again. It was early morning, before Ruth was awake, in the thin hour when the light came low and blue through the kitchen window and the whole town was quiet. Nora had taken to coming down early, when she could, making coffee sitting at the kitchen table with the window cracked and the air still cool before the day and its requirements closed in. She was sitting with her coffee when she saw him through the window. He was at the water trough on the north side of the street, filling a pair of canteens. His horse was tied to the post beside him, a big gray animal, solid built, standing with its head low in the patient way of horses that had spent a lot of time waiting. She watched him for a moment, the way you watch someone who doesn't know they're being watched with a freedom of attention not available in most social situations. He moved efficiently. No wasted motion. He capped both canteens, checked the cinch on his saddle, ran a hand down the horse's neck once briefly. The horse turned its head toward him. He said something she couldn't hear through the glass. Then he looked up, directly at the window, directly at her. She didn't look away in time. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat, a brief economical gesture, and turned back to his horse. Nora sat for a moment, looking at the space where he'd been. Her coffee was getting cold. She drank it anyway. The thing about a small town is that it has a long memory and a short tolerance for complications. Harrow Creek had decided on the Calloway women. Years ago, Ruth was useful. Nora was Ruth's, and the arrangement was everyone's business. In the way that service arrangements always become everyone's business, in a place where there isn't enough actual news. What Harrow Creek had not figured out was what to do about Ethan Walker. He had arrived 3 weeks ago from the mountain range north of town. The Blackhorn Range, a stretch of granite and pine that most people considered good for nothing, and a handful of men considered home. He had bought the property at the edge of the valley, the old Marsh place that had sat empty for 4 years since Henry Marsh drank himself off his own land. Nobody knew exactly what Ethan Walker intended to do with it. Nobody had asked him directly, because Ethan Walker was the kind of man that direct questions bounced off of. He came into town twice a week, bought what he needed, spoke when spoken to, and did not seem to require anyone's good opinion to function. The town, which ran on good opinion the way most engines ran on fuel, found this deeply unsettling. Dangerous man, she heard Mr. Whitfield tell a customer one afternoon when she was in the store selecting thread. Too quiet. And that land, what's a man doing up in the Blackhorns alone? Ranching, I heard, the customer said. Alone, no crew, no family. Whitfield shook his head. Not natural. Nora selected her thread and said nothing. The confrontation with Fletcher Hargrove had not ended in the pressing room. Nora knew that the way she knew most things that were coming, not clearly, not with dates and times, but with the particular low-level dread that had been her early warning system for most of her life. Fletcher had not spoken to her again. He hadn't needed to. He had instead spoken to people the careful, quiet kind of speaking that men like Fletcher specialized in, the kind that left no fingerprints. He had said things in the right ears about the Calloway girl's behavior, her attitude, her ingratitude toward the Hargrove family's generosity. By the end of that week, 2 households had canceled their mending arrangements with Ruth. Ruth had said nothing to Nora about the cancellations directly. She had simply become quieter and colder, which was Ruth's method, the pressure of her silence building like weather. On Friday evening, she sat Nora down across the kitchen table. The Hargrove work is finished, Ruth said. Yes. Mrs. Hargrove will not be requiring us again. Nora waited. You said something, Ruth said. Or did something, at the house. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know what it was, because what I do know is that it cost us money, and it cost us standing. She paused. Do you have anything to say? There were several things Nora could have said. No, ma'am, she said. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. You are going to be the ruin of me, she said quietly. Not with heat. With the flat certainty of a woman stating a fact she had considered from all angles. Everything I have built in this town, every connection, every reputation, every careful inch of ground, and you will throw it away through your stubbornness and your pride, and your complete inability to simply do what is required of you. I do what is required of me every day, Nora said. And then, because she was very tired, and because 3 days of Fletcher Hargrove's distributed damage was sitting on her chest like a stone, she added, every day without exception, I do exactly what is required of me. Ruth stood up. The slap was harder than the one on the street. Nora's chair scraped back. She caught herself against the wall. For a moment she stood there breathing, looking at the floor. Then she looked up. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, she said. You'll sleep where I tell you to sleep. I'll sleep in the barn, Nora said again, and her voice surprised her. It was level and steady. and something in it had decided something. She went to the barn. She sat in the dark on a bale of hay, listening to the horse shift and breathe, and she let herself have every opinion she had been saving. She did not see it coming. She had not seen the way Fletcher Hargrove's slow anger had been looking for a more direct expression, or the way his particular pride, the kind that could not absorb a public correction without payment, had been calculating. The following Tuesday, she was walking back from the post office alone with a stack of letters Ruth had asked her to collect when Fletcher stepped out of the alley beside the barber shop. He had 2 men with him. Not men she recognized, not from town. Hired, she thought instantly. Men who were paid not to remember things. "Nora Calloway," he said with the pleasant smile. "Just who I was looking for." She turned immediately and walked the other way. His hand came down on her shoulder. Now, he said. "We're just talking. I have nothing to say to you." She tried to step around him. The 2 men moved not aggressively, just into position the way you position furniture. To block. To funnel. Fletcher's hand tightened on her shoulder. "I think you owe me an apology," he said, "for the scene you made at my mother's house. With your," he said the name with something close to amusement, "your rescuer." She said nothing. "He won't always be around," Fletcher said, "and I have a long memory." "So do I," said a voice. Fletcher turned. Ethan Walker was standing in the middle of the street. He had come from nowhere and everywhere, or rather, he had come from the direction of the post office, unhurried, and had simply arrived. He stood there, with his thumbs in his belt and his hat level and his eyes on Fletcher Hargrove, with the quality of attention that if Nora had to name it, she would have called, very specifically, patient. "I seem to keep finding you in situations you shouldn't be in," Ethan said. He glanced briefly at the 2 hired men, then back at Fletcher. "Twice is a coincidence, 3 times is a habit." He paused. "I don't like habits that involve this woman." Fletcher let go of Nora's shoulder. He did it the same way he'd let go of her wrist, slow, deliberate, making it look like choice. "She's nothing to you," Fletcher said. "That ain't for you to decide," Ethan said. A long moment. The main street of Harrow Creek had gone quiet in the specific way that small-town main streets go quiet when something is happening. Not empty, but stopped every person within eyeline, suddenly interested in being still. Fletcher looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Fletcher. "This isn't finished," Fletcher said. "I know it ain't," Ethan said. "But today it is." He stepped to the side, a gesture that was somehow simultaneously relaxed and absolute, creating a line through which Nora could walk. "Miss Calloway." She walked. She walked past Ethan down the main street, and she did not run, because running would have meant that her legs had stopped working the way she required them to, and she was not going to allow that. She heard him fall into step behind her. Not beside her. Behind. Far enough to give her air, close enough that anyone watching would understand the geometry. At the end of the main street, where the road bent toward the residential area, she stopped. She turned. He stopped too. "You keep showing up," she said. "Appears so," he said. She studied him. It was hard to read that face, not closed exactly, but experienced in the way of faces that had learned not to spend expression on things that didn't require it. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because nobody else is," he said. And then, as though the conversation had been sufficient, "You should get home before that sun gets lower." "Mr. Walker." "Ethan," he said. She paused. "Ethan." The name felt odd in her mouth, foreign. "Thank you." He touched the brim of his hat, and he walked away. She watched him go. She thought about it afterward, not constantly, not the way she might have thought about it in a different life, in a life where she had the luxury of wondering about men who were kind to her. But in the quiet spaces, the early morning coffee and window time, she thought about it. He had shown up twice. Both times before she'd even known she needed him. Both times without making anything of it, without demanding credit, without the look that certain men got when they did a woman a favor, that proprietary look, the one that was accounting, that was keeping a ledger. He hadn't looked at her like that. He had looked at her like she was a person. It was remarkable, she thought, how unusual that was. She was hanging washing on the line behind the house on a Friday morning. The tail end of the week, the heat already building by 9 when Ruth appeared in the back doorway. Her expression was different. Not the flat managing expression of daily operations. Not the cold pressure expression of contained anger. Something she hadn't seen on her mother's face in a long time. Fear. "There are men in the front yard," Ruth said. Nora set down the shirt she was holding. "Whose men?" Ruth wet her lips. "Fletcher Hargrove's." Nora crossed the yard, went through the side gate. 3 men standing at the front of the property, not the same 2 from the alley. Different men, official seeming in the vague way of hired men who wanted to look official. One of them was holding a paper. "Ruth Calloway," the one with the paper said. "I am she," Ruth said, appearing behind Nora. "This is notice of debt collection," the man said, holding out the paper. "From the estate of Whitfield Lending, authorized by Fletcher Hargrove as managing agent. You have an outstanding loan from 4 years past, and it has been called in." Ruth's face went the color of old ash. "That loan was settled," she said. "According to our records, it was not." "I have the receipt, if you can produce it," the man said, with the patience of someone who had been briefed on this exact objection. "You are welcome to bring it to the offices of Whitfield Lending. In the meantime, the notice stands. You have 30 days. He held out the paper. Ruth took it. Nora watched the 3 men walk back to their horses. She looked at her mother. Ruth was looking at the paper. "He manufactured this," Nora said, quietly. Not a question. "I don't know," Ruth said. "I do," Nora said. "He manufactured it, and if you go to Whitfield Lending's office, you will find that your receipt is insufficient or missing from the records or contested, because that is exactly how men like him operate." She paused. "The receipt, do you actually have it?" Ruth was silent for a moment. "I had it," she said. "I don't know where it is now." Nora stood looking down the street at the retreating figures. She was 19 years old. She had no money, no standing, no powerful friends. She had a mother who had built a life on the labor of her daughter's hands, and a town that had watched her be struck in the face on a public street and looked away. And she had one very particular thought. She was not going to let Fletcher Hargrove take the last thing they had. She went inside. She got her hat. She went to find Ethan Walker. She didn't know where he lived. She knew only the general direction north toward the Blackhorn Range, the marsh property he'd bought. She took the road out of town, and she walked because she had no horse, and the July heat pressed down on her shoulders like something with intentions. She had been walking for 40 minutes, the road turning from packed dirt to rougher ground, the tree line beginning to close in on either side, when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She stepped to the side of the road. The gray horse came around the bend and slowed, and Ethan Walker looked down at her from the saddle with an expression that was impossible to categorize. Surprised, she thought, if that was something he was capable of showing. "Miss Calloway," he said. "I need to speak with you," she said. "I know I have no right to ask for your time. I know I have nothing to offer in exchange, but I need to speak with you." He looked at her for a moment. Then he dismounted. He did it in one clean movement, both feet on the ground, and he turned to face her without any of the elaborate waiting that men sometimes did the performance of consideration. "Then speak," he said. So she did. She told him about the debt notice, about Fletcher Hargrove, about the 2 encounters he'd already witnessed and the one in the alley he hadn't, about the canceled mending work, about the way a man like Fletcher, who had never once been told no and believed it did not understand the word, except as a starting point for something uglier. Ethan listened. He stood in the road with his horse's reins in his hand, and he listened, the way very few people had ever listened to her, not waiting for a gap to speak, not planning his response while she was still talking, not deciding what to believe and discarding the rest. Just listening. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You walked out here to tell me this," he said. "Yes." 40 minutes at least from town. Yes, in July, he said with something that was almost but not quite dry. I didn't have a horse. He looked at her for another long moment. Do you know what you're asking me for? He said. Not charity, she said immediately. Not rescue. I'm asking if there's anything to be done legally or through someone with more standing than I have. I'm asking because you seem to know something about what men like Fletcher Hargrove actually respond to, and I am running out of time to figure it out myself. He nodded slowly. I know, he said. A lawyer in Breckenridge, man named Okafor. He handles exactly the kind of manufactured debt that men like Hargrove specialize in. He paused. He'll need the original loan documents, whatever Ruth has, and any correspondence. We may not have the receipt. Then we find out if the lending records are as clean as Hargrove thinks they are. Something shifted in his expression, brief controlled, but there. Men who manufacture things tend to do it in a hurry. Hurried manufacturing has seams. She looked at him. Why are you helping me? She said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, because someone should, he said, and because I've been watching that town not do it long enough. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. He helped her up onto the gray horse, settled her in front of the saddle, and swung up behind her in the matter-of-fact way of a man performing a practical solution to a practical problem. I'm taking you back to town, he said, and then I'm riding to Breckenridge. The horse moved forward. She gripped the saddle horn and looked at the road ahead, at the mountains visible over the trees, blue and permanent and indifferent, and she thought about seams in manufactured things, and about the particular quality of a man who listened without deciding, and about doors that had the possibility of being something other than closed. And she did not, for the first time in longer than she could remember, look for something still to fix her eyes on. She didn't need to. Ethan rode back into Harrow Creek 2 days later. Nora knew he was back before she saw him. She heard it from Mrs. Alderman's daughter, who had heard it from the boy who worked at the livery, who had seen the gray horse come in at first light, tired and road-dusty, with its rider looking like a man who had pushed hard and slept little and didn't mind either. She was in the middle of pressing Mrs. Cook's tablecloths when the information reached her. She finished the tablecloth. She folded it. She hung it properly and moved on to the next one. She did not run to the window, but she pressed that next tablecloth faster than she had pressed anything in recent memory. He came to the back door of the Calloway house that evening at the hour when the light was low and the street was emptying into supper, and it was possible to knock on a door without the whole town cataloging the knock. Nora answered it because Ruth was in the front room, and Ruth would have opened the door and then closed it again in the same motion. The way she closed most things she hadn't decided the value of yet. Ethan stood on the back step. He had his hat in his hand. Behind him, the last of the sun was going out over the ridge. I spoke with Okafor, he said. And it's as I thought. He paused. The original loan was to your father, 19 months before he died. It was transferred to your mother's name in the settlement of the estate, but the transfer documentation was Okafor's word was irregular. He believes Whitfield Lending doesn't want that irregularity examined in front of a judge. Nora stood very still. Meaning Hargrove's debt notice is built on ground he doesn't want tested, Ethan said. Okafor is writing a letter. It'll go to Whitfield Lending directly citing the transfer irregularity and requesting documentation that Okafor believes they cannot cleanly produce. He looked at her steadily. It won't be fast, but it'll hold. How much does Okafor charge? Nothing. Ethan. He owes me a favor, he said. Old debt. Don't worry about it. She looked at him for a long moment. She had been handed things before Charity dressed up in various costumes, and she had learned to recognize the weight of obligation that came attached. This didn't have that weight. It had the weight of something different, something she didn't have a clean name for. Come in, she said. I have coffee. He looked briefly surprised, or as surprised as that face ever got, which was a slight shift in the set of his jaw. But he stepped inside. Ruth appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room. She looked at Ethan Walker in her kitchen with the expression of a woman doing very rapid and very private calculations. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Ma'am?" He put his hat on the table carefully, crowned down the way you treat a thing you mean to pick up again. "I heard you've been making inquiries," Ruth said, "on our behalf." "I spoke to a lawyer I know," he said, "about the debt notice." Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked at Nora. Something moved across her face. Not gratitude exactly, but in the neighborhood of it, the closest Ruth Calloway allowed herself to travel in that direction. "I see," she said. "And then, I'll leave you to your coffee." And she went back to the front room. Nora poured the coffee. Ethan sat at the kitchen table. It was the first time she had seen him at rest, or what passed for rest with him. He sat with both hands around the cup and his shoulders down, from where she'd seen them outside the outdoor vigilance reduced to something more interior. He was still watchful. She didn't think he was ever not watchful. But the quality of it was different in here. "Tell me about the Marsh property," she said, because she needed to say something that wasn't "thank you again." He looked at her over the cup. "What about it? What do you intend to do with it?" "Ranch it," he said. "Cattle." "Eventually. Right now I'm fixing the structure. The barn went soft in 2 of the main posts, and the upper pasture fencing needs a full replacement." He paused. "It's a lot of work." "Alone," she said. "Alone," he confirmed without any particular feeling about it. "Do you prefer it?" He considered. It was one of those questions he seemed to take seriously rather than dismiss, and she was starting to understand that this was characteristic, he thought, before he spoke, and he said what he meant when he spoke, and he didn't add much decoration. "I'm used to it," he said. "Preference is something different." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "What's the difference?" "Preference implies you chose it," he said. "Used to it implies it's what remained after everything else went." He looked at the window briefly. "I'm not certain I've had enough of other options to have a real preference." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a very honest answer." "I don't see a good reason to be dishonest about it." She looked at him. There was something in his face. Not sadness exactly, not loneliness displayed the way some men displayed it, wearing it like an accusation at the world. It was something quieter, more held. "You said you'd been watching this town not help," she said. "For how long have you been watching?" "Since I arrived," he said. 3 weeks before you and I before the Hargrove house." He looked back at her. "I've been in enough places to know the arrangement of them. Who gets protected? Who gets used? Who the town has decided doesn't count." His voice didn't change. It was flat and level, and it landed with a weight she felt in her chest. "I've been in towns that had you categorized before you said a word." "And yet you said a word," she said. "I said more than one," he said. And something shifted in his eyes just briefly, a degree of warmth she'd been wondering if he was capable of, and was gone again. She almost smiled. She didn't quite, but it was close. They finished the coffee. He put on his hat at the back door. He told her Okafor's letter would arrive at Whitfield Lending within the week, and that she should not go there herself, not yet, not until the letter had time to work. She nodded. He said goodnight briefly without flourish. She closed the door and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she went to do the dishes. She washed the 2 cups, hers and his, and she thought about the word preference, and the word remained, and she thought she understood something she didn't quite have words for yet. She let it sit. Some things needed time before they had words. The letter from Okafor reached Whitfield Lending on a Thursday. By Friday morning, every parlor in Harrow Creek knew about it. By Friday afternoon, Fletcher Hargrove had ridden through town at a pace that communicated volumes without saying a single word. His jaw was set in the particular way of a man who had been surprised and did not like the sensation, and intended to address it loudly. He went to Whitfield's store. Nora, coming out of the baker's 2 doors down, saw him go in. She kept walking. She was halfway down the block when she heard the door open behind her, and she knew without turning that it was him, because the boot sound was wrong, too fast, too deliberate aimed. Miss Calloway. She stopped. She turned. She made herself do it calmly. Fletcher had his hat on, and his coat straight, and his pleasant smile located. But the pleasant smile was doing extra work today, and the strain showed in the corners of it. Beside him, just behind his left shoulder, stood one of the men from the general store, not hired this time. Amos Creedy, who ran the town council and had the handshake of a man who kept his hands soft because he'd never needed to use them for actual work. "I thought we should have a proper conversation," Fletcher said, "without interference." "I'm on my way home," Nora said. "This won't take long." He took one step closer. She held her ground. "This lawyer your cowboy found Okafor, he's a nuisance. That's all. A nuisance that you've bought yourself about 3 weeks of delay with. After that, the debt stands, and your situation is exactly where it was. Except now you've made an enemy of my family, in a town where my family has significant influence." "I'm aware of your family's influence," Nora said. "Then you understand what it means to have it working against you." "I understand what it means to have it working against me," she said. "I've understood that for several weeks. Nothing you're telling me is new, Mr. Hargrove." His smile thinned. "What I'm telling you," he said more quietly, "is that this doesn't have to continue. There's a simple solution. You come work for my household proper arrangement paid position, and all of this—" He gestured vaguely at the invisible architecture of pressure he'd constructed. "Goes away. The debt, the canceled contracts. All of it." Amos Creedy nodded as though this were the reasonable conclusion to a reasonable conversation. Nora looked at Fletcher. She thought about every polite formulation available to her. She thought about the cost of each one, the way politeness in this particular situation would be read as possibility, as negotiation, as a door she was leaving open. "No," she said. "Nora." "Miss Calloway," she said. "And no." She walked away. She walked 2 blocks before her hands stopped shaking. She hadn't let them shake while he was looking at her. But once she turned the corner, and the main street was behind her, she let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just done, refused to Hargrove directly without softening, without an escape hatch offered to either of them, and her hands understood, before the rest of her did, what that was likely to cost. She put them in her pockets. She kept walking. What she didn't see, what she didn't know, until Ethan told her later, was that he had been on the other side of the street. He had seen Fletcher approach her. He had started across. But then he had stopped. He had watched her say no. He had watched her walk away. And then he'd gone back to what he'd been doing with a feeling he wouldn't describe until much later. And then only briefly. Something that was pride, he thought. Although that was somebody else's word for it, and he didn't know if it quite fit. What he felt was more like recognition. The particular recognition of seeing someone do a hard thing cleanly. He told her this on Saturday when he came back to deliver news from Okafor. A second letter was coming, this one citing specific documentation irregularities that Okafor now suspected had been manufactured rather than overlooked. "You were there," she said, "across the street. You didn't come over." "You didn't need me to," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She was at the kitchen table mending one of her own things, for once a simple cotton sleeve she'd torn on the fence gate 2 days ago, and she looked at the needle in her hands rather than at him. "I was afraid," she said. "I know. My hands shook afterward." "I know that too." She looked up. "How?" "Because you put them in your pockets," he said, "before you turned the corner." She stared at him. He held her gaze steadily with the unself-consciousness of a man who had said a true thing and didn't see a reason to take it back. "You were watching closely," she said. "I was," he said, simply, without apology. She looked back at her mending. The needle went through the fabric, out the other side. "That's," she started. "Nora," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. Not Miss Calloway. Her name. It stopped her mid-sentence. "I'm not going to pretend I don't notice things," he said. "I've never found the point in that." A silence. "No," she said finally. "I don't suppose you have." The following Tuesday changed everything. It changed it in the way that things in Harrow Creek always changed publicly on the main street in front of enough witnesses that there was no version of events that could be quietly renegotiated afterward. Nora had gone to the post office to collect the mail, the same errand she performed every Tuesday, the same route, the same ordinary architecture of a day. She was coming out of the post office when she nearly walked into Ida Hargrove. Not Fletcher, his mother. Ida Hargrove stood on the post office steps in full day dress, with two women from the Ladies' Aid Society positioned behind her, like a set of expensive curtains. She looked at Nora the way a woman looks at something she's decided to address. "Miss Calloway," she said. "Mrs. Hargrove." Nora held the mail and waited. "I have heard," Ida said in the particular tone of Harrow Creek's most careful social demolisher, "that you have been involving yourself with persons who have been making legal inquiries on your behalf, into private lending arrangements." "A lawyer sent a letter," Nora said, "on my mother's behalf, about a debt notice we believe was incorrectly issued. My son issued that notice in good faith. With respect, Mrs. Hargrove, your son issued that notice 3 weeks after I declined his offer of employment at your household, and after 2 of our contracts in town were canceled without explanation." She paused. "I don't believe that sequence is coincidental." The Ladies' Aid Society curtains rustled. Ida Hargrove's expression did something complicated. "You are a very impertinent young woman," she said. "I am an honest one," Nora said. "I apologize if they're difficult to tell apart from a distance." She stepped down from the post office steps and walked toward home. She did not look back. Behind her she heard Ida Hargrove say something to the curtains too low to make out. She heard one of the curtains respond. She kept walking. She was 2 blocks away when she heard the footsteps behind her, and this time she spun around because she was done being surprised from behind. It was not Fletcher. It was Ethan Walker, moving at a pace that suggested he had seen something and responded to it. He slowed when she turned. He stopped. "I heard," he said. "Of course you did," she said. "In this town everyone hears everything before it's finished happening." "Are you all right?" "I am extremely all right," she said, and the word extremely came out with a force that surprised them both. She pulled a breath. "I am tired," she said more evenly. "I am tired of being careful. I am tired of measuring every word and every look and every response against what it might cost. And I am—" She stopped herself. Ethan waited. "I am," she said quietly, "very tired." He looked at her for a long moment. "Come to the ranch," he said. She blinked. "What?" "Not today. Sunday. Come see what I'm building up there." He paused, and it seemed to cost him something, not much, but something. "I don't invite people, but I'm inviting you." She searched his face for the subtext, for the accounting she'd trained herself to find in any offer. She found none. He looked back at her with the same uncomplicated steadiness he always had. "All right," she said. "Sunday morning," he said. "I'll meet you at the North Road." He turned and walked back toward the main street. She looked at the mail in her hands. 1 letter, 2 circulars, a receipt notice from the dry goods supplier. She walked home and thought about Sunday. Ruth said nothing when Nora told her, which meant Ruth had plenty to say and was holding all of it in reserve, which was in Nora's experience significantly worse than whatever Ruth would have said aloud. She waited through dinner. After, when the plates were done and the kitchen was clean, Ruth sat down across from her with the particular positioning of a woman who has decided the reserve is full enough. "What is this man to you?" Ruth said. "He's been helpful," Nora said. "He's been considerably more than helpful," Ruth said. "He's been in this kitchen. He went to Breckenridge on our behalf, and now he's inviting you alone to his property." She paused. "This town watches everything, Nora." "I know." "What they say about a young woman who goes unchaperoned to a bachelor's property is the least of my concerns right now," Nora said. "This town watched you be struck in the face on a public street, and not one person said a word." Ruth went very still. Nora didn't take it back. She held her mother's gaze. "I stopped worrying about what this town thinks of me approximately 3 weeks ago," she said. "Ethan Walker has been more decent to us than anyone in this town has been in 6 years. If he wants to show me what he's building, I'd like to see it." A long silence. "He's a man," Ruth said finally, not as warning, as something more complicated, almost as Nora thought the beginning of a concession. "Yes," Nora said. "He is." Ruth stood up and went to the window, looking out at the dark. "Be back before supper time," she said. Sunday arrived carrying the particular clarity of a summer morning in the high country, dry and sharp, and still the kind of air that makes everything look further away and more itself at the same time. Ethan was at the North Road when she got there, the gray horse saddled and a second horse on a lead line, a smaller bay mare that he handed off to her with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man solving a logistics problem. "Can you ride?" he said. "Adequately," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Adequately gets you there," he said, and swung up. She mounted the bay. They rode. The road north out of Harrow Creek climbed steadily, the valley floor dropping behind them, the trees closing in on both sides before opening onto higher ground. He didn't talk much while they rode, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It had the quality of a silence between people who don't need to fill space to prove they're present. She asked him about the Blackhorn Range. He told her about it with the particular fluency of someone describing a thing they know through their body rather than through description. The elevation, the temperature changes the way weather moved differently up here than in the valley. "You grew up in mountains," she said. "Western Montana," he said. "Different range, same principle." "What happened to Montana?" He was quiet for half the moment. "My father died. The claim we were working went back to the company. My brother—" He stopped. Something in the set of his shoulders shifted. "My brother didn't survive the winter after that." She didn't say she was sorry. She said, "How old were you?" 22, he said. "And you've been alone since then." "Mostly," he said. He looked ahead at the road. "I did some work for a cattle outfit in Wyoming for a few years. Trail work. But—" He paused. "Hard to be around people after you've lost the ones that mattered. You keep waiting for them to leave, and eventually you decide it's easier to get ahead of it." She recognized that. She recognized it in the specific way of someone who has lived the same logic in a different context. "So you got ahead of it," she said. 12 years of ahead, he said, not bitter, just stating the length. She thought about that 12 years of a man staying ahead of the moment someone would leave. 12 years of empty structures and full silences. "Is that enough?" she said. 12 years. He looked at her. "I'm starting to think," he said carefully, "that I was never asking the right question." The Marsh property. His property now, Walker's land, whatever. Harrow Creek would eventually agree to call it, came into view as they crested the upper pasture. She heard him before she saw it. No, she heard what he'd done to it. The fence line was new, the posts set clean and plumb, the wire tight. The barn doors were re-hung on proper hardware. The main structure had a new section of roof on the west side. He'd been working constantly, alone. For weeks. She dismounted at the gate and he took both horses. "It's not finished," he said, which she understood to be the only apology he would offer for the state of things. "I can see what it will be," she said. He looked at her. "Most people see what it is." "Most people aren't looking at the same thing," she said, and walked through the gate. He showed her around with the guided efficiency of a man who had rehearsed none of this. The barn first, the repaired posts, the new loft floor. The kitchen garden he'd started more practical than aesthetic, 3 rows of things he would actually eat. The upper pasture fence which had cost him 2 full weeks. She asked questions. Not polite questions, real ones about load-bearing specifications, and whether the kitchen garden soil had been amended, and what his plans were for winter feed. He answered every one. At the east side of the property, where the fence line met the tree edge, they stopped. The valley was visible below them, From here the whole of Harrow Creek laid out small and self-important in the summer haze. "You can see the whole town from here," she said. "Yes," he said. "Does that help?" she said. "Being above it." He thought about that. "It helps with perspective," he said. "Doesn't fix anything. But perspective has a use." She looked at the town. At the tiny geometry of the main street, the white point of the church steeple, the smudge of smoke from the blacksmith. She thought about Ruth at the kitchen window, about Fletcher Hargrove's slow smile, about Ida Hargrove and her curtains, and the word impertinent deployed like a verdict. "I used to look at the mountains from town," she said. "When things were—" She paused. "I'd look at them and think about how indifferent they were to all of it. I found that comforting." He turned to look at her. "The indifference, the consistency," she said. "They're always there. Whatever's happening down here, they don't alter." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what I wanted," he said. "When I bought this, not the indifference, the consistency." He looked out over the valley, something that didn't change with whoever was deciding its value. She understood that perfectly. She turned to say so, and found he was already looking at her, not with the brief checking look she'd catalogued from before, but steadily, with the full quality of his attention, the kind he usually reserved for things he was deciding. She held it. Her heart was doing something she didn't quite authorize, but it was doing it, and she didn't look away. "Nora," he said. The name again, direct and certain. "Yes," she said. Also direct. Also certain. She didn't know what she was answering exactly, but it felt right to answer it. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, "I should get you back before supper time. Your mother was specific." It broke just enough to let them both breathe. "She was," Nora said. He took the horses from the fence. She walked beside him to the gate beside him, not behind, and she noticed this, and he made no adjustment, as though it had always been the arrangement. On the ride back, he said, "There's going to be more from Hargrove." "I know," she said. "Okafor's letter will hold the debt, but that's not what Hargrove's actually about. The debt was leverage. When the leverage fails, men like him find different leverage." "What kind?" "The kind that involves people talking," he said. "Reputation standing. He'll go at you sideways through what people believe about you because he can't come at you straight anymore." She thought about this. "He'll go at you too," she said. "Through the same channel. You've been seen with me. In this town that has implications." "I know," he said. "And that doesn't stop you." He looked at her from his horse steady and unhurried. "No," he said. "It does not." They rode back into Harrow Creek in the long gold light of Sunday afternoon. 2 riders on the North Road, and every person who saw them noted it, and every noting was its own small stone dropped into the still water of the town's accumulated opinion. What happened after was the inevitable consequence of the stones. She just didn't know yet how far the ripples would reach. The ripples reached Ruth first. She came home from the market on Monday morning with her basket only half full and her face arranged in the particular tight configuration that meant she had heard something she was still deciding how to process. She set the basket on the kitchen table. She unpacked it slowly: flour salt, 2 onions, a paper of dried beans. She did not look at Nora. Nora waited. "Mrs. Pendleton would not speak to me at the market," Ruth said finally. She folded the paper bag and set it by the door. She turned away, physically turned, with Mrs. Dougal standing right there to see it. "I'm sorry," Nora said. "Are you?" Ruth said. Not with heat. With something more honest than heat, which was fatigue. "Because I warned you. I told you this town watches everything, and I told you what they say about a girl who goes unchaperoned to a decent man's property," Nora said. "Yes, you told me. And you went anyway." "And I went anyway." Ruth sat down. This was unusual. Ruth did not sit in the middle of the morning. Ruth moved through the morning like a current through a river, purposeful and continuous. She sat down and put both hands on the table and looked at them. He's going to have to marry you, Ruth said. If this continues, if you're going to keep seeing him, he's going to have to make it formal, or you won't have a reputation left to protect by winter. Nora looked at her mother. She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about the word marry, and all the weight it carried, and all the ways it had been used her entire life as a solution to problems that had nothing to do with love. I have known Ethan Walker for less than a month, she said. I know how long you've known him. He's not... She paused. This isn't something I can make happen on a schedule because the town needs it to happen. The town, Ruth said, looking up, has already made its decision about what's happening. What you actually do is somewhat beside the point. She looked at Nora for a long moment. I have never, she said slowly, asked you to like your circumstances. I've asked you to be practical about them. I know. This man... Ruth stopped. She tried again. I am not saying he is a bad man. I do not believe he is a bad man. But I need you to understand what I am telling you. What you do next will determine whether you have options in 5 years or whether you have none. Nora sat across from her mother at the kitchen table, and for a moment she saw her clearly, not the manager, not the system of control and production, but a woman who had watched everything she'd built come apart twice, who moved through the world with her fists closed because opening them had cost her too much. A woman who loved her daughter in the only language she'd ever been taught, which was the language of danger and preparation. I hear you, Nora said quietly. Ruth nodded. She stood up. She went back to unpacking the basket. That was as close as they got to understanding each other that day. Fletcher Hargrove began in earnest on Wednesday. Nora didn't see the opening move directly. She felt it the way you feel, weather before it arrives in the changed quality of the air around you. The baker's wife, who had always greeted her with at least a nod, looked past her. The woman who did alterations for the wealthier households and had occasionally sent overflow work. Nora's way closed her door with a particular timing when Nora came down the street. Small things. The vocabulary of exclusion, which is always spoken quietly and with perfect deniability. But Thursday gave her the direct version. She was at the well on the north side of the main street when Clara Whitfield, the storekeeper's daughter 17, whom Nora had helped with mending lessons 3 winters ago, came up beside her and stood waiting her turn. They had always been friendly. Not close, but warm in the way of women who share a functional space without competition. Clara didn't speak. Nora looked at her. Clara was looking at the well with the focused attention of someone avoiding eye contact with a specific intention. Clara, Nora said. Miss Calloway. Formal, distant. The distance of someone who had been told something. What have you heard? Nora said. Clara looked at her finally. She had the expression of a girl caught between what she'd been instructed and what she actually thought, and in her case instruction appeared to be losing. Mr. Hargrove's been saying things, she said, lowering her voice, about why you went up to that man's property, about what kind of girl does that, about... She stopped. It's not kind what he's been saying. I know, Nora said. It's not true either, Clara said, with the conviction of someone who had known Nora long enough to have data. But people here... She stopped again. My father says we can't afford to be... She swallowed. I'm sorry, Nora. She took her water and left. Nora finished at the well. She stood for a moment with the weight of the bucket in her hand, and the weight of the town on her chest, and the particular loneliness of being understood privately by people who couldn't afford to say so publicly. Then she went home and made supper. She did not go looking for Ethan. She had decided something not consciously, not all at once, but in the accumulating quiet of the last several days about what she would and would not use him for. She would not use him as a shield. She would not put him in front of things so she could stand behind him. Whatever was happening between them, whatever it was becoming, she would not let it become that. He came to her. Friday evening, backstep hat in hand, the way she was starting to think of as simply how he arrived. He looked at her face. You've had a week, he said. I've had a week, she agreed. Tell me. She told him. Clara Whitfield. Mrs. Pendleton turning at the market. The closing door. The vocabulary of exclusion which she described to him in exactly those words, because she didn't have a simpler one. He listened. He held his hat in both hands and turned the brim slightly, while he listened, the only physical evidence of whatever was moving through him. When she finished, he said, "He's trying to make you into a problem he can solve." "Yes," she said. "If your reputation is damaged enough, your choice is narrow. You become someone who needs a resolution he controls." He paused. The work offer at his household. "It was never really an offer," she said. "It was a category. Put me in the category of woman who owes him something and everything else follows." "Yes," he said. "So the question is what to do about it." He was quiet for a moment. "Okafor's second letter went out," he said. "The irregularities in the lending documents are significant enough that Whitfield Lending has already contacted Hargrove's father about the exposure. The debt notice is effectively dead. But you're right that this was never about the debt." He looked at her steadily. "This is about what he thinks he's owed." "He thinks he's owed compliance," she said. "He thinks I was impertinent, and someone should have made me understand my position, and since no one did, he's making me understand it now." "Yes," Ethan said. And then, with the careful delivery of a man choosing his words precisely, "I would like to address that." She looked at him. "Meaning," she said. "Meaning I'd like to speak to him directly," Ethan said. "Not threaten. Not—" He paused. "I want him to understand that what he's doing has a witness, that the particular campaign he's running has been seen and named. Men like that operate in ambiguity. Name what they're doing, and they lose the ambiguity." She thought about this. "He'll deny it. Of course he will. But the denial will be between him and me, and he'll know I know, and that changes the calculation." He paused again. "With your permission." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're asking my permission." "It involves you," he said. "So yes." Something moved through her, not emotion exactly, not yet, but the precursor to it, the way light changes before a thing becomes visible. She had been asked in her life many things. She had rarely been asked permission. "Yes," she said. "You have it." What happened between Ethan Walker and Fletcher Hargrove the following morning was not witnessed by Nora. She had its edges from Ethan, who reported it in his characteristic style, chronological, factual, without embellishment. He had gone to the Hargrove house at 8 in the morning, which was deliberate morning, when Fletcher was still organizing his day and hadn't yet arranged himself into the social armor he wore by midday. Ida Hargrove had answered the door and looked at him with the expression she apparently kept specifically for inconvenient arrivals. "My son is at breakfast," she'd said. "I know," Ethan had said. "That's why I came now." He'd gone in. Fletcher had looked up from his eggs with the expression of a man interrupted in the one moment he'd designated as his own. "Walker," he said. "Hargrove," Ethan said. He'd sat down uninvited, which was its own statement. "I'll be brief. The debt notice is finished. You know this, your father's been in contact with Whitfield Lending about the exposure, and pursuing it further will cost your family more than it gains." He'd paused. "What I came to discuss is what's been happening this week. The conversations you've been having in this town about Nora Calloway." Fletcher had put down his fork. "I don't know what you're referring to." "Yes, you do," Ethan had said simply. "I'm not here to argue about whether it's happening. I'm here to tell you that I've named it, that I know exactly what it is, and that if it continues, I will take that name to Okafor, and we will determine together what legal standing there is for a systematic campaign of reputational damage against a private individual." He'd paused. "That's not a threat. That's the next step on a path that you've been walking, and I'm telling you where the path goes before you take another step on it." Fletcher had looked at him for a long moment. "You're very attached to this woman," Fletcher had said in a tone that was trying to be an insinuation. "That isn't your business," Ethan had said. I think it is. I think you've got an interest that goes beyond neighborly concern, and I think this town is going to notice the same thing. The town, Ethan had said, can think whatever it wants about me. I'm not running for anything. He'd stood up. I'm asking you to leave her alone. As a courtesy, because I'm extending one to you by being here privately, rather than putting what I know in front of people. He'd picked up his hat. That's all. He'd walked out. When Nora heard this, all of it, every word delivered to her at the back step that evening, she sat very still. You told him it wasn't his business, she said. About your interest in me. Yes. But then you told him to leave me alone. Yes. Those two things together say something, she said. He held her gaze. I know what they say. She looked at him for a long time. Her hands were in her lap. The evening was warm, and the air smelled of hay and dry earth, and something she couldn't name, which was the smell of a summer in which too many things were changing too fast. Ethan, she said. Nora. What are we doing? She said, not plaintively, the way she asked everything direct and requiring a real answer. He was quiet for longer than usual. I don't know yet, he said, but I know it's something, and I know I don't want to name it before it's ready to be named because names have a way of... He stopped. I've said things before that didn't end up being true. I don't like saying things that turn out to not be true. She understood that. She understood it with the comprehension of someone who has also learned not to trust their own sentences. All right, she said. Then we don't name it yet. He nodded. But Ethan, she said. Yes. Whatever it is, she said, I'd like it to keep being. Something in his face shifted a degree of opening brief and unguarded that she stored carefully and did not press on. Yes, he said. So would I. The first twist came on a Tuesday in the way of all the worst things ordinary morning unremarkable until it wasn't. Nora was at home when the man from the land office arrived. He was from the county seat, not from Harrow Creek, and he had the manner of someone accustomed to delivering information that made people upset and had learned to pace his sentences accordingly. He had documents. He sat across the kitchen table from Ruth and laid them flat. This is a notice of property claim, he said, filed by Hargrove Holdings against the parcel currently occupied by the late James Calloway estate. Your lease on this property expired 14 months ago, Mrs. Calloway, and has been in informal continuation since then. Hargrove Holdings has filed to formalize the claim under Territorial Land Statute. Ruth looked at the documents. Nora looked at her mother's face. This was the color she realized that true shock made. Not the ash of anticipated bad news. The gray-white of something that had not been predicted could not have been the color of the ground moving. We have lived here 6 years, Ruth said. Her voice was level, completely level, which meant she was spending everything she had on that levelness. The lease was in your husband's name, the man said. It was not transferred at his death. The property reverted to Hargrove Holdings as owner of record at expiration 14 months ago. The informal continuation. My husband's name, Ruth said. James Calloway. Yes, ma'am. And Hargrove Holdings has owned this property for how long? 17 years, ma'am. Ruth looked at Nora. Nora looked at the documents. Fletcher Hargrove's father, she thought. Not Fletcher. This was older than Fletcher. This was Walter Hargrove, who had owned property in this town for decades, who had let things sit quietly until they became useful, until someone gave them a reason to become useful. How long do we have? Nora said. 30 days, miss. Same as the debt notice period. He left them the documents. He left them the 30 days. He took himself out with the careful courtesy of a man who had done the required thing and wanted to be elsewhere. Ruth sat at the kitchen table and did not move. Nora stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at the documents and thought very rapidly through the architecture of what had just happened. The debt notice had been about leverage. She'd been right about that. But it had also been a test to see what she had, what she would do, who would help her. And they had responded, and Ethan had gone to Breckenridge, and Okafor's letter had arrived, and the debt notice had crumbled. And so Fletcher or his father, or the combined machinery of Hargrove Holdings, which had apparently been running quietly underneath all of this, had moved to the thing that couldn't be solved with a legal letter. The house. The 6 years. The ground Ruth had built her careful Harrow Creek life on. "We need to go to Ethan," Nora said. Ruth looked up. For once, she said nothing to contradict this. They rode north on a borrowed horse double-mounted, which was undignified and uncomfortable, and neither of them mentioned it. Nora had never brought her mother to the Walker property. She wasn't certain how Ethan would receive this, not the visit, but the shape of it, the urgency, the two women on one horse arriving with 30 days in a document folder. He was in the upper pasture when they arrived. He saw them from the fence line and came down. He took the document folder from Nora's hand. He read it standing in the way he did everything without hurry, but also without wasted time. When he finished, he looked up. "Walter Hargrove," he said. "Yes," Nora said. "Not Fletcher." "No." He looked back at the document. Something was happening behind his eyes. Calculation she had learned to recognize it, the particular quality of a man running through implications. "This changes what we're dealing with," he said. "Fletcher was about pride. Walter Hargrove is about land." "What's the difference?" Ruth said. She had not dismounted. She sat on the horse and looked at Ethan Walker with the measured assessment of a woman making decisions about trust. He looked at her directly, which she seemed to appreciate. "Fletcher wanted to manage your daughter," he said. "Walter Hargrove wants this property. It's likely been in his plans for years. Fletcher gave him an occasion to move on it." "Then this was never about the mending contracts," Ruth said. "The contracts were convenience," Ethan said. "The property was always the target." Ruth was quiet. Then, "Can it be fought? The expired lease can't be contested, that's legitimate. But the formal claim filing has a process, and within that process, there are questions about the adequacy of notice given at expiration, whether the informal continuation was accepted with an understanding of ongoing tenancy, and whether the filing now constitutes retaliation under territorial statute." He paused. "Okafor needs to see this today." He handed the folder back to Nora. "I'll ride to Breckenridge in the morning," he said. "Again," Nora said. "Again," he said without any particular feeling about it, the way he said most things that had already been decided. Ruth looked at him from the horse. She looked at him for a long moment, with the full battery of her attention, which was considerable. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Ma'am." "Why?" she said. Simply. The same question Nora had asked him weeks ago on a dusty road. He held her gaze. "Because it's right," he said. "And because your daughter asked me once if someone should, and I said yes, and I meant it." Ruth was quiet for another moment. She looked at Nora. Something passed between them. Brief, complex, the particular communication of mothers and daughters, who have spent years in a language with very few direct words for tenderness. Ruth looked at her daughter, and looked at this man, and she made a calculation that was different from all the calculations Nora had seen her mother make before. Less about cost, more about something else. "Then I am grateful," Ruth said, with the precision of a woman for whom those words did not come easily, which made them mean more. She turned the horse toward the road. "Ruth," Ethan said. She looked back. "Stay with the Alderman house tonight," he said. "Mrs. Alderman and your mother were friends, weren't they?" Ruth looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because Walter Hargrove filed a property claim this morning," he said. "And when you ride back into that town, I'd prefer you weren't in a house he already considers his." Ruth absorbed this. She nodded once. She rode south. Said. Nora didn't follow immediately. She stood in the yard, and Ethan stood beside her, and they watched Ruth go until the road bent and the horse and rider disappeared into the tree line. "She'll fight you for years about this later," Nora said. "I know," he said, "and she'll be grateful for all of it at the same time and never say so." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him. You read her faster than most people do. She reminds me of someone, he said. Who? He looked at her. She understood. She looked away toward the valley, toward the invisible town below them. What happens if Okafor can't stop the claim? He was quiet for a moment. Then we figure out what else there is. That's not an answer. It's an honest one, he said. I don't know yet, but I know that we figure it out. We, she noted. Not you, not I. She filed that carefully, the way she filed other things about him, not to be examined too closely yet, but to be kept. Ethan, she said. Yes. Walter Hargrove has been in this town 17 years. He owns the property we live on. He owns, I would guess, several other properties in Harrow Creek. He has relationships with every person on the town council. Fletcher is his son. She turned and looked at him squarely. What does going up against him cost you? Ethan looked at her with the expression he got when he was deciding whether to be fully honest. The land question, he said. The marsh property, my property. The north boundary is in dispute with an old Hargrove claim. I've been aware of it since I bought the land. I've been working around it, waiting for the right moment to file for formal resolution. He paused. If I push Hargrove hard on this, he pushes back there. The boundary dispute becomes active, and it becomes active with the full weight of his resources behind it. She took this in. So you could lose the ranch, she said. I could, he said. And you told me this after agreeing to go to Breckenridge again. Yes. Because you should know it, he said. And because it doesn't change what I'm going to do. She felt something in her chest that she was not going to name right now. Something large and certain and terrifying. You could lose everything, she said. I've lost everything before, he said. Not bitterly, not dramatically. Just the statement of a man to whom this fact was data. Montana, the claim my brother. I know what losing everything feels like. He looked at her steadily. And I know what it feels like to not fight when you should have. A pause. I won't do that again. The second twist hit her then, not from outside, but from inside. She had been so focused on what was being done to her, what was being taken, what Fletcher and Walter Hargrove were building against her, that she had not seen clearly until this moment what Ethan Walker was building. Not just toward her, for her. He was building toward a thing that could cost him the only ground he'd found after 12 years of having none. And he was doing it not because he was rescued and wanted to repay a debt, but because he had looked at a girl on a street and seen something worth protecting. And once he saw it, he could not unsee it, and Ethan Walker did not do halfway. She had been so careful, so practiced at not being moved by things that turned out to be leverage. She looked at him. You need to know something, she said. All right. I have spent my entire life, she said, making sure that I am not anyone's project, not anyone's charity case, not anyone's problem to solve. She stopped. And I have been very careful with you to make sure this wasn't that. I know, he said. But I need to tell you. She stopped again. The words were right there, and they were true, and they were more frightening for being true. Nora, he said quietly. I know what you're doing, she said. What you're risking, and I need you to know that I see it. Not just I'm not going to be someone who takes that and doesn't acknowledge it. You don't have to. I do, she said. I do have to, because I am. She looked at him, this careful, quiet, 12 years alone man, who turned the brim of his hat when he listened and asked permission before involving himself, and said he meant what he said, and then proved it. I am not indifferent to you, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever happens with the property, with Hargrove, with all of it, I am not indifferent. He held her gaze. For a long moment he said nothing, which she had learned was not dismissal, but the space he gave to things that deserved it. Then, neither am I, he said, in case it wasn't clear. It was becoming clear, she said. Then it's clear now, he said. They stood in the yard of his property in the high summer light, with 30 days and a boundary dispute, and Walter Hargrove's entire machine between them and anything uncomplicated. He reached out. He took her hand, not dramatically, not with any words attached, just the hand his and hers, and the steady heat of it, and the decision communicated by that plainest of gestures. I am here, and I am not leaving, and this is what I have to offer right now, and it is not nothing. She held it. For a moment, that was exactly as long as it needed to be. Then they let go. There was work to do. Ethan left for Breckenridge before dawn. Nora knew because she was already awake. She had barely slept the document folder on the table beside her bed. Ruth's breathing in the next room at the Alderman house slower than usual, in the way of people who have exhausted themselves with composure. She lay in the dark and thought about boundary disputes and 30-day notices, and a man who had already lost everything once and was walking toward the possibility of losing it again with the same expression he brought to fence posts and water troughs and everything else he'd decided to do. She was at the kitchen table with coffee when Mrs. Alderman came down at 6, and she told her quietly that they might need to stay another night, possibly 2. And Mrs. Alderman, who was 71 and had been in Harrow Creek long enough to know the Hargrove name, the way you know Weather said without hesitation, "You stay as long as you need." Some people in this town, Nora was learning, had been waiting for a reason to be decent. They just needed someone to go first. Ruth came down at 7. She looked at Nora, and at the coffee, and at the absence of panic on Nora's face, and she sat down and accepted a cup and said, "What do we do today?" "We wait," Nora said. "Ethan's in Breckenridge. Okafor needs to see the filing." "And while we wait, we document," Nora said. "Every contract we've fulfilled in this town, every payment received, every communication with the Hargrove household, every date and amount and name." She looked at her mother. "If this goes in front of a judge, I want a record that shows exactly what our life here has been, what we built, what we're owed." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "When did you become this?" she said. "Become what?" "This." Ruth gestured at her, all of her, the coffee, the table, the steadiness. "I spent 19 years trying to make you practical." "You did make me practical," Nora said. "I just applied it differently than you planned." Ruth looked at her coffee. A sound escaped her that wasn't quite a laugh, something between that and something else. It was the closest thing to warmth Nora had heard from her mother in years. They spent the morning at the table with paper and pen, building the record together. The town council met on Thursday afternoons. Nora knew this not because she had ever attended. Women of her standing did not attend council meetings, but because the rhythm of Thursday afternoons in Harrow Creek had always had a particular quality to it. Men moving purposefully toward the meeting hall. Conversations on the street, dropping lower, the whole town arranging itself around the fact that something official was happening. She was walking back from the post office on Thursday when she saw Walter Hargrove for the first time. She had seen Fletcher dozens of times. She had built a complete picture of Fletcher, his slowness, his pleasantness, his accounting of grievances. Walter Hargrove was something different. He was 64, shorter than his son, with the compact solidity of a man who had spent 30 years making things permanent. He moved without Fletcher's performance. He had no pleasant smile because he had never needed one. A man with Walter Hargrove's resources didn't require pleasantness. He required results. He was coming out of the bank as Nora was passing it. He looked at her. She stopped because something in the quality of that look required stopping. "Miss Calloway," he said, not a greeting, an identification. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. He looked at her the way he might look at a map, noting features, assessing terrain. "You've created some difficulty for my family," he said with the matter-of-fact calm of someone stating geography. "Your family created difficulty for mine," she said. "I've been responding to it. My son," he said, "is impulsive. I won't pretend otherwise. What he did with the debt notice was impulsive, and I'm aware that it didn't hold." He paused. "The property filing is not impulsive. The property filing is legal documented and will proceed through proper channels regardless of whatever your lawyer friend in Breckenridge attempts." "I understand," she said. "Do you?" He looked at her steadily. "I'm not your enemy, Miss Calloway. I have no particular interest in your difficulties. What I have is a legitimate property claim on land that should have been formalized over a year ago. The fact that it intersects with my son's," he paused, "grievances is unfortunate timing, but it doesn't change the legal reality." "With respect," Nora said, "the timing suggests something other than coincidence." "Perhaps," he said, "but timing is not standing. Courts care about documents." He put on his hat. "I suggest you find alternative accommodations before the 30 days expire. That would be the practical course." He walked toward the meeting hall. She stood on the boardwalk and watched him go. He was right about the documents. He was right about the courts. He was calm and certain and had 30 years of Harrow Creek under his feet, and she was 19 with a pen and a record that proved they'd worked hard and been paid for it, and not a single word about property rights. She walked back to the Alderman house. She picked up the pen. She kept writing. Ethan came back Friday morning. She heard the gray horse before she saw him. That distinctive ground-covering pace, unhurried but consistent, that she had learned to distinguish from other horses. She was on the alderman porch when he rode up. He dismounted and came up the steps, and she read his face, which had become over these weeks a document she had learned to interpret. He had something. "Come inside," she said. Ruth was in the front room. Mrs. Alderman had gone to her sister's for the morning. Ethan sat across from both of them and put his hands flat on his knees, which she had learned was how he organized himself before a long explanation. "Okafor found something," he said. She sat forward. "The Calloway property, the house you've been living in the lease, was in your father's name, yes. But the original lease agreement from 18 years ago, when your father first signed it, contained a renewal clause. Standard language at the time." He paused. "The renewal clause states that in the event of the leaseholder's death, the tenancy transfers automatically to the surviving spouse for the remaining term, and is renewable at the same rate for as long as the surviving spouse or dependents remain in continuous residence." Ruth's hands, which had been folded in her lap, went still. "Transfers automatically," Nora said. "The lease renewed on your mother the day your father died. Not through any action on her part. Not through any filing. It renewed by the terms of the agreement itself." He looked at Ruth. Hargrove Holdings either didn't know about that clause, which is possible. The original lease was handled by a previous agent who's been dead 12 years. Or they knew and filed the property claim anyway, hoping no one would look. "Which is it?" Ruth said. Her voice was very controlled. "Okafor believes they didn't know," Ethan said, "because if they'd known and filed anyway, they'd have exposure for fraudulent claim, which Walter Hargrove is too careful to risk. His son might, but not him." He paused. "Which means the property claim is built on an incomplete reading of their own documentation." The silence in the room had a specific quality. Nora had lived in a particular kind of silence her whole life. The silence of suppressed things, held back things, the silence of a household that had learned to keep its feelings behind glass. This silence was different. This was the silence after a door opens. "It's over," Ruth said. "The property claim is over," Ethan said. "Okafor is filing the response today with the original lease documentation attached. Walter Hargrove will have it by Monday. His lawyers will read it by Tuesday." He looked at both of them. By Wednesday, they'll have quietly dropped the filing because Walter Hargrove did not get where he is by pressing losing claims in public. Ruth made a sound. Nora had never heard her mother make that sound. Small compressed a single syllable that contained everything a woman of Ruth Calloway's particular structure could not say directly, all of it escaping at once through one unguarded moment. She put her hands over her face. Nora reached across and put her hand on her mother's arm. Ruth let her. That was the remarkable thing. For a long moment, Ruth Calloway let her daughter hold her arm, and she sat behind her own hands and felt whatever she felt, and the room was quiet enough to allow it. Ethan stood up and went to the window, giving them the space of his turned back. Nora looked at him from across the room. his back, his shoulders, the set of him, and thought that this was also a way of saying something. This quiet, deliberate turning. This making himself elsewhere so they could be themselves. She thought, I know what I feel. She was just waiting for the right moment to say it clearly. The right moment took its time arriving because the week that followed was a particular kind of busy. The property claim was dropped by Wednesday, as Ethan had predicted. Walter Hargrove sent no communication, offered no acknowledgement. The filing simply disappeared from the county records office as though it had never been made, which was, Nora thought, the Hargrove way of handling a defeat. Not graceful, just absent. Fletcher did not appear on the main street for 4 days. When he did reappear, he looked like a man who had been spoken to by his father at considerable length, which had the effect of making him smaller, not in size, but in that quality of ambient confidence that had always preceded him like weather. He was still Fletcher Hargrove, but something had been adjusted. He looked at Nora once across the main street, and she held his gaze, and he looked away first. That was all. She did not celebrate it. She filed it the same way she'd filed everything else, and she went on with her day. What she had not gone on with, what she had been carefully not pressing, waiting for the architecture of crisis to stop, demanding all available attention, was the thing between her and Ethan. He had come to the Alderman house twice more in the week after the property claim fell. Both times practical updates from Okafor, a question about the lease documentation information about the boundary dispute on the Walker land that he was still navigating. Both times they had sat at Mrs. Alderman's kitchen table with coffee and talked about what needed to be talked about, and then reached just at the edge of the practical, that other territory that they had agreed not to name yet. Both times they had stopped at the edge. She felt it like a current. The way you feel a river current against your legs, not pushing you exactly, but making the direction extremely clear. On a Friday evening, with the property matter resolved, and the immediate crisis replaced by the slower work of rebuilding their standing in the town, she went to the Walker property. She went alone on the bay mare he'd left at the livery for her use, without ever formally offering it, which was how he did most things, simply making the thing available and letting her decide. He was in the barn when she arrived. He heard the horse and came to the barn door, and he looked at her dismounting, with the expression he reserved for things that surprised him, that minimal shift in the jaw, the slight recalibration. "Nora," he said. "I have something to say," she said, tying the mare. "And I've been waiting for a week that was quiet enough to say it, and I don't think quiet weeks are going to be reliably available, so I'm saying it now." He leaned in the barn door and watched her. She turned around. "I have been afraid my entire life of needing something," she said, "of wanting something and not getting it, of reaching toward a thing and having it be leverage in someone else's hands. I have been so careful, for so long." She stopped. "I am 19 years old, and I have been careful for as long as I can remember, and I am finished with it." "Nora." "Let me finish," she said. He went quiet. "You went to Breckenridge twice," she said. "You faced Fletcher Hargrove in his own house. You put your boundary dispute at risk. You turned your back in a room so my mother could feel something in private." She looked at him. "You have been—" She stopped, recalibrated, went again. "You have been the most careful person toward me that I have ever known. Not careful like managing me. Careful like you were paying attention to what I actually needed, instead of what was convenient for you to give." He was looking at her steadily. "I need to know," she said, "what this is. Not because the town needs it named. Not because my mother needs it named. Because I need it named. For me." She held his gaze. "What is this, Ethan?" He was quiet for long enough that someone who didn't know him might have mistaken it for hesitation. She knew him now. It wasn't hesitation. It was him making sure that what he said next was exactly true. "It's the most certain thing I've had in 12 years, he said. "That's what it is." She breathed. "And what I want," he continued with the careful precision of a man who had promised himself he wouldn't say things that turned out not to be true, "is to keep building this, slowly, properly, with your full knowledge of what you'd be taking on, which includes a man who spent 12 years alone and has some rough edges from it, and a boundary dispute on the north pasture, and a town that's going to watch everything we do." He paused. "And with my full knowledge of what I'd be taking on, which is a woman who has more backbone than anyone I've ever met, and will argue with me when I'm wrong and probably be right. I will be right more often than that," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "I expect so," he said. She looked at him for a moment. This man, this careful, quiet 12 years alone man, who had shown up in Harrow Creek and seen her before she'd finished understanding what it meant to be seen. She crossed the yard. He met her halfway because he always had, and when she reached him, he put his hands on her face with the same care he brought to everything. The precision of a man who understood that this was not a thing to be handled roughly. And he looked at her from very close for a moment that was long enough to be a question and an answer both. She answered it. She kissed him first. Because she had also decided she was finished waiting for things to come to her. His hands didn't move from her face. He kissed her back the way she might have predicted if she'd let herself predict it, steadily, unhurriedly, with the full attention of a man who was not thinking about anything else in that moment and didn't need to. When they separated, she stayed where she was close enough to see every detail of a face she had spent weeks learning. "I should have done that 2 weeks ago," she said. 3 weeks ago, probably, he said. She laughed. It came out of her like something released real and sudden, and with no performance in it. She felt him smile against her temple, brief and quiet, his version of the same. "Ethan," she said. "Nora." "Whatever comes next with Hargrove," she said. "With the town, with the boundary dispute. We handle it." "Yes," he said, simply, like a thing already decided. She stepped back enough to look at him properly. "I'll need to go back before supper." "I know." "Ruth will." "I know what Ruth will," he said. She held his gaze. "Will you come Sunday?" "To the Alderman house?" "To speak to Ruth," she said. "Formally. However you want to frame it, but formally." He understood what she was asking, the geography of it, what it meant in 1884 in Harrow Creek for a man to speak to a woman's mother formally. He did not perform surprise. He did not recalibrate. He held her gaze with the steadiness that was simply who he was. "Sunday," he said. "Yes." "Bapo." She rode back to Harrow Creek in the long gold evening, and when she reached the Alderman house, Ruth was on the porch. Ruth looked at her daughter the way mothers look at daughters who have come back from somewhere different, from where they left, reading the quality of the air around her, the set of the shoulders, the thing in the eyes that had shifted. Ruth said nothing. Nora tied the mare. She came up the porch steps. "He's coming Sunday," Nora said. "To speak with you." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "I'll need the good cups," she said. The twist that Nora had not seen coming arrived the following morning. It came in the form of a letter not from Okafor, not from Whitfield Lending, not from the county land office. From a name she didn't recognize at first. James Alderman, attorney at Law Breckenridge. Not Okafor. Someone else. She stood at the post office and read it twice. Then she walked very fast to the livery and saddled the bay mare. The letter was addressed to her, which was already strange. It stated that James Alderman had been in correspondence with Marcus Okafor regarding the Callaway matter, and in the course of that correspondence, certain documentation had come to his attention relating to the original Callaway estate. Her father's estate, the debt-riddled wreck of a life that Ruth had been paying for in various ways since his death, and in particular, to a land patent in her father's name that had never been properly dissolved. A land patent. Not a lease. A land patent. She rode north faster than she'd ridden anything. Ethan read the letter twice. Same as she had. He lowered it and looked at her. "Your father filed a land patent," he said. "Apparently," she said. "Before I was born. Before they moved east. Before everything. He filed a patent on a parcel in Montana Territory, and then—" She stopped. "I don't know what happened. The letter doesn't say why they left it, whether they forgot about it or couldn't get to it or... Patents don't expire, Ethan said. She knew enough from these weeks to know what that meant. She made herself wait for him to say it. A land patent issued to your father, he said carefully. In his name does not transfer in the way a lease does. It's property. It goes to the estate. Which means... He stopped, looked at her. Which means when your father died, the patent went to Ruth, and Ruth never knew about it. The kitchen was very quiet. Montana territory, she said. Yes. She looked at him. He looked at her. Your territory, she said. Western Montana, he said. I'd need to see the parcel number, but... He stopped again, something happening in his face that she was reading carefully. Nora, do you understand what this means? Tell me, she said. Because she wanted to hear him say it. It means Ruth Calloway owns land, he said. Land that has been sitting in her name, technically legally in her name, since James Calloway died. It means that the woman who has been mending other people's clothes and being struck in the face on a public street and having her house threatened out from under her, his voice did something just briefly that she had never heard it do before, has been a landowner this entire time and didn't know it. Nora pressed her hands flat on the table. She was not going to cry. She was going to breathe and be practical because there was a great deal to figure out, and crying did not help figure things out. She breathed. She was practical. We need Okafor to verify the patent status, she said. And we need to know what the parcel is. Size, condition, whether there's anything on it. I know that part of Montana, Ethan said. You know everything about that part of Montana. I know enough, he said. And then carefully, Nora. If the parcel is viable, if it's real land, working land, that changes everything. I know, she said. Not just for Ruth. For you. She looked at him directly. It changes the geography, she said. Of all of it. Yes, he said. She thought about what she was about to say. She thought about whether it was too fast, too certain, too much to put into the air when there was still verification needed and documents to chase and Okafor to contact and a formal Sunday visit that hadn't happened yet. Then she decided she was done being careful about things she was certain of. Would you know the land, she said. If you saw the parcel number, would you know what it is? Likely, he said. Then I want you with me, she said. When we find out, whatever it is. He held her gaze. I'm not going anywhere, he said. She nodded. She picked up the letter. I need to go tell Ruth, she said. She was almost at the door when he said her name. She turned. He was standing at the table with both hands flat on it, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the careful watching, not the calculated steadiness. Something more open, more directly his. Whatever that land is, he said, whatever it's worth, it doesn't change what I said Friday. She understood. He was telling her that the Montana patent hadn't landed between them as a complication of value and inheritance, and standing that he wasn't recalculating her based on the new information wasn't adding up what she'd just become. He was telling her that he'd said something on Friday, and he meant it on Saturday, and the letter hadn't moved him. I know, she said. That's why I told you first. She left him standing in the kitchen and rode back down toward Harrow Creek with her spine straight and the letter in her pocket and the particular feeling of a woman who has been underground for a very long time and can finally feel the direction of up. Ruth was at the Alderman kitchen table when Nora came through the door. She had been sorting buttons, a task that had no urgency, and everything to do with needing something for her hands while her mind worked on things she wasn't saying aloud. She looked up when Nora came in, read her face the way she always read her face, and set the buttons down. What happened? She said. Nora put the letter on the table. Ruth picked it up. She read slowly the way she read everything important, not hurrying, making sure she understood before she responded. Nora watched her mother's face move through the stage's attention, then focused attention, then something that cracked slightly at the corners of both eyes and was immediately controlled. Ruth set the letter down. She looked at it for a moment. "James," she said, quietly. His name. Just his name. Not with bitterness and not with grief exactly, with something older than both, something that had been sitting in a closed room for 6 years, and was suddenly quietly letting light in. "Did you know?" Nora said. "No," Ruth said. He mentioned Montana once, before you were born. He said he'd tried something out there that hadn't worked, and he'd come east." She paused. "He didn't say patent. He didn't say land." She looked at her hands. "He wasn't good at telling me things." "I know," Nora said. "He wasn't good at a great many things." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "But he filed that patent. Before he came east, before everything, he filed it, and he kept the documentation." She stopped. "He kept it, Nora. It was in his papers. That's how Alderman found it." "He was trying to build something," Nora said. "Even then, he was always trying," Ruth said. The tone was complex. Not forgiveness exactly. Ruth Calloway would not arrive at forgiveness all at once. That was not her character. But the beginning of a more complicated accounting, one that included the patent alongside the debts. They sat with that for a moment. Then Ruth straightened. She picked the letter back up and read it again, more practically this time. "What does Ethan say?" "He knows that part of Montana," Nora said. "He wants the parcel number. He says patents don't expire." Ruth's mouth pressed together. "What does that mean practically? What does it mean for us?" "It means you own land," Nora said. "Land that has been yours since the day Father died. It means every contract you've honored in this town, every payment you accepted on someone else's terms, every morning you sent me out before sunrise, you were doing all of that while standing on ground that was already yours. You just didn't know where it was." Ruth's composure held. It held for approximately 3 more seconds. Then it didn't. It wasn't dramatic. Ruth Calloway did not do dramatic. But her chin dropped, and she pressed one hand flat over her eyes, and she breathed one breath, too sharp and controlled. And in those 2 breaths, Nora heard 6 years of Harrow Creek, and a dead husband and buttons sorted by lamplight, and a daughter's cheek, and everything that had been swallowed to keep moving. Nora put her hand over her mother's. Ruth let her. 3rd time now. Nora was counting. Every time Ruth let her, she counted it. Tete. Okafor's confirmation arrived Thursday. The parcel was real. 240 acres in western Montana Territory in the upper valley of a river. Nora couldn't pronounce correctly the first time she tried, and Ethan corrected her without making anything of it. Timber on the north and east faces a creek running through the lower portion, a structure. The letter said structure, which could mean anything from a standing house to 4 walls and ambition on the southeast quarter. 240 acres. Ruth read the confirmation letter standing up. She did not sit down. She held the paper and stood in the middle of Mrs. Alderman's kitchen and read it twice, and then set it carefully on the table and smoothed the fold across the middle. "I want to see it," she said. Nora looked at her. "Not immediately," Ruth said. "I understand there are processes. I understand it takes time. But I want to see it." She looked at Nora with the particular directness that was the truest version of her. "I want to stand on ground that belongs to me." "You will," Nora said. "When?" "I don't know yet, but you will." Ruth nodded. She picked up the letter. She folded it properly and put it inside her dress against her chest, which was where she kept the things she was not willing to put down. Sunday arrived the way Sundays do, when something is supposed to happen on them, with a quality of held breath, the hours moving both faster and slower than usual. Ethan came at 10 in the morning. He was dressed with the particular care of a man who does not normally think about such things, and therefore, when he does, it shows the same clothes essentially, but cleaner and pressed, and with his hat in his hand from the moment he dismounted. He knocked on the Alderman front door instead of coming around back. Nora answered it. They looked at each other. "Ruth's in the parlor," she said. "All right," he said. "She has the good cups. Something in his expression shifted, that almost but not quite thing that was his version of warmth. "Good," he said. She brought him through. Ruth was seated in the front parlor chair with the posture of a woman who had decided exactly how this was going to go and had arranged herself accordingly. The cups were on the small table. There was coffee in the pot, and 2 chairs across from her, and the whole scene had the quality of a formal proceeding that was also undeniably something else. Ethan sat down. He put his hat on his knee. He looked at Ruth directly. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Walker," she said. "I expect you know why I'm here," he said. "I have a reasonable idea," she said. "I want to speak to you about Nora," he said. "About my intentions, formally. Because she deserves formal, and because I think you do too." Ruth looked at him steadily. "Then speak," she said. Which was, Nora noted from her chair to the side, almost exactly what she had said to Ethan on a dusty road weeks ago. She had her mother's directness, and had never known it until recently. "I intend to court your daughter," Ethan said, "with a view to marriage if she'll have me when the time is right for both of us. I'm not asking you for permission, because she's not mine to ask permission about. She's her own, and she's made that clear, and I respect it." He paused. "What I'm asking you for is your knowledge, so that nothing between Nora and me happens without you knowing it's happening, because she comes from you, and you matter to her, even when the 2 of you would rather argue about it." The parlor was very quiet. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. She was reading him the way she read everything carefully from every angle. "You said she's her own," Ruth said. "Yes, ma'am." "You understand what that means, practically, for a man." "I understand that it means she'll make her own decisions," he said. "And I'll make mine. And we'll talk about the ones that affect us both." He paused. "I've been alone a long time, Mrs. Calloway. I don't have much to offer in terms of ease. I'm not an easy man, I know that." He held her gaze. "But I know how to stay. I haven't been able to say that about much in my life. I can say it about this." Ruth looked at him for another long moment. She looked at Nora. Nora looked back at her mother with the expression that said, "I know. I know what he is. I know what I'm doing." Ruth picked up the coffee pot. She poured his cup first. That was her answer. Anyone who knew Ruth Calloway understood she poured your cup first when she had decided you were worth the courtesy. Ethan understood it too. She could see it in the way he received the cup, both hands a slight incline of his head, the recognition of what the gesture meant. "The Montana land," Ruth said, pouring her own cup. "What do you think it is?" "I think it's good land," he said. "Upper Valley in that part of the territory usually is. The creek is promising fresh water. On a parcel means usable land year-round." He paused. "I'd like to ride out and see it, before any decisions are made about what to do with it." Nora said. Both of them looked at her. "We'd like to ride out and see it," she said. Ethan looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "We would." Ruth looked at her coffee. "I'll need someone to manage the arrangements," she said with the tone of a woman who had already decided and was now constructing the logistics. "I assume your Mr. Okafor can assist with the travel documentation." "He can," Ethan said. Then Ruth said, "We will need to discuss timing." And they did. For an hour, the 3 of them sat in Mrs. Alderman's front parlor with the good cups and talked practically about the land, the travel, the timing, the state of the Walker property's boundary dispute, which Ethan updated them on with his characteristic brevity about what Ruth's standing in Harrow Creek looked like now, with the property claim dropped and the debt notice dissolved and Okafor's correspondence on record. They talked about what staying in Harrow Creek offered versus what Montana offered and what each of them needed it to offer. It was the most direct conversation Nora had ever had with her mother. Because Ethan was in the room, she thought. Not mediating, he said less than either of them. But his presence had a quality that made directness easier. Like he had leveled something by simply being someone who said what he meant. When he left, Ruth walked him to the door. This was also remarkable. Ruth did not walk people to doors. People walked themselves. At the door, she stopped him. "Mr. Walker," she said. He turned. "James filed that patent the year before we met," she said. "He went to Montana with nothing, and he tried to build something, and it didn't work, and he came east, and he never told me about it." She paused. "He spent the rest of his life trying to build things that didn't work, and not telling me about them." She looked at Ethan Walker with everything she was. "My daughter is not going to spend her life with someone who builds things without her." "No, ma'am," he said. "She is not." Ruth held his gaze for one more moment. Then she nodded and closed the door. 3 weeks later, Okafor's office produced the travel documentation, and Ethan resolved the boundary dispute. The resolution was not dramatic. Walter Hargrove, who had received Okafor's letter about the fraudulent property claim and absorbed the exposure quietly, was not inclined to press secondary battles at this particular moment. The boundary was surveyed, acknowledged, and filed, and the Walker property's north line was established at exactly where Ethan had always said it was. Harrow Creek noticed. The town that had watched Ruth Calloway be categorized as a service arrangement, and Nora Calloway as her means of service, watched a land patent materialize from a dead man's papers, and a property claim evaporate, and a boundary dispute resolve, and Ethan Walker ride north every Sunday and come back south with the particular look of a man who has found the fixed point he was navigating toward. The town shifted, not all at once, not with any acknowledgement of what it had done. Small towns do not apologize. They simply begin behaving as though the thing they did was the exception, and the current arrangement was always the intention. Mrs. Pendleton spoke to Ruth at the market. Clara Whitfield brought Nora a small jar of preserves and said nothing of the weeks of avoidance, and Nora accepted them and said nothing either, because some things were better received than confronted. Mrs. Alderman, who had known for weeks what was building and had watched it build with the satisfaction of a woman who had wanted this specific thing to happen, told Nora, "I knew the moment I saw him at the water trough. A man who talks to his horse like that doesn't have bad in him." "What did you see him say?" Nora said. "I couldn't hear it," Mrs. Alderman said, "but it was something kind." The morning they left for Montana was a Tuesday in late August, the summer beginning its first lean toward something else, the light a degree cooler and more angled than it had been at the height of July. Ruth rode in the wagon Ethan had hired, upright hat on the Montana patent documentation in a leather folder on her lap. She had packed with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to transporting everything important, which meant she packed light and packed right and was ready an hour before the others. Nora rode the bay mare. Ethan rode the gray. They left Harrow Creek on the north road as the town was waking up, and a handful of people were out on the main street to see them go. Not a crowd, not a ceremony. Just the ordinary people who were up early and happened to be there, who watched three riders heading north with the quality of attention you give to things that have settled into being true. Clara Whitfield was on the bakery porch. She raised her hand. Nora raised hers back. They rode. The journey to Montana took 11 days. 11 days of terrain and weather and the particular intimacy of people traveling together, which strips away the formal and leaves only the actual. Nora learned things about Ethan on those 11 days that she hadn't been able to learn in Harrow Creek, the way he read weather, which was early and accurate. The way he set a camp, which was efficient and quietly attentive to what the others needed. The way he was with Ruth, who by the fourth day had begun speaking to him directly, instead of through Nora as interpreter. On the fifth evening, Ruth said to him, "Tell me about your brother." He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her. Nora listened from across the fire. She had heard the outline Montana, the claim, the harsh winter, the loss. But she hadn't heard the inside of it, and Ethan told it to Ruth the way he told everything that mattered plainly, without performance, with the particular weight of words that have been held for a long time and are finally being set down somewhere safe. His brother's name had been Daniel. He was 19 when he died. He had wanted to be a schoolteacher. He had read every book that came within 20 miles of the claim borrowed and returned borrowed again. He had been, Ethan said, the kind of person who made you better just by being nearby. Like her. Ethan said, not looking at Nora, but meaning her the fire between them. Nora looked at the fire. Ruth looked at Ethan. "You've been carrying him 12 years, Ruth said. "Yes," he said. "That's long enough," she said. Not unkindly, with the directness of a woman who had also carried someone too long and was beginning slowly to understand the weight. Ethan looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I think it is." The land was on the 11th day. They came down into the upper valley in the morning, following Okafor's parcel directions, and Nora felt the moment they crossed onto it before anyone said so. Something in the way the ground changed the creek audible on their left, the timber standing dense and straight on the north face. 240 acres. Real. Ruth climbed down from the wagon. She didn't say anything. She walked out into the middle of the lower pasture, and she stood there with the leather folder under her arm, and she looked at it, all of it, the reach of it, the creek and the timber and the structure visible on the southeast quarter, which was not 4 walls and ambition, but an actual standing building, weathered, but there's someone's previous intention, still holding its shape. She stood there for a long time. Ethan tied the horses and came to stand beside Nora. "It's good land," he said quietly. "You knew it would be," she said. "I hoped," he said. They watched Ruth. Ruth bent down. She picked up a handful of the soil and held it in her palm, and looked at it the way you look at something you've been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. She closed her hand around it. She stood back up. She did not turn around, but her shoulders moved, something releasing in them, some long-carried tension departing from the place it had lived so long it had built a house there. Nora made a sound. Small and involuntary. Ethan put his hand on the back of her shoulders. Light. Steady. There. She leaned into it, not much, just enough. Not needing to be held up, just choosing to feel where he was. "She worked so hard," Nora said. Her voice was quiet. "For so long. For other people's floors, and other people's tables, and other people's linens. And she was standing on her own ground the whole time." "She'll know it now," he said. "It doesn't fix what it cost her." "No," he said. "But it's hers. That counts for something." She turned and looked at him. He was watching Ruth with the expression she had seen him use for things he respected, quiet, full, no performance in it. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "I love you," she said. It came out without ceremony because it had been arriving for weeks and waiting was no longer a reasonable position. He looked at her for a moment with that face, the face she had learned to read every degree of it, and what was in it now was not the careful watching or the calculated steadiness. It was the open version, the unguarded, decided version. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." "That's an infuriating thing to say," she said. "I love you too," he said, in case it needed saying. "It needed saying," she said. "Then I'm saying it," he said. "Nora Calloway, I love you. This is the most certain I have been about a thing since I understood what certainty means." She looked at him for a moment. Then she put her hand on his jaw, and he let her, and she kissed him the way she'd kissed him the first time she went first, because she had decided she was done waiting for things to come to her, and she would keep deciding that for the rest of her life. Ruth turned around eventually. She saw them. She looked at them for a moment with the expression of a woman receiving the final piece of information required to complete a picture she had been assembling for some time. She said nothing. She turned back to the land. But before she turned, Nora saw it, the smallest thing, the thing Ruth Calloway would never acknowledge and never needed, to one corner of her mouth. Just slightly. Enough. The twist no one had seen coming arrived on the 3rd day on the land, while Ethan was inspecting the southeast structure for foundation integrity, and Nora was helping Ruth measure the lower pasture's dimensions. A rider came down from the north. Not threatening, a single man older on a spent horse wearing the kind of clothes that meant he'd been traveling for days. He pulled up at the property line and called out, "Looking for the Calloway party." Nora walked toward him. "That's us." He reached into his coat. He pulled out a letter. "From the Montana Territorial Land Office," he said. "In response to the patent verification filed through Okafor in Breckenridge." He handed it down. "You'll want to read that before you make any plans for this parcel." He turned his horse and rode back north. Nora stood in the pasture with the letter in her hands. Ruth came up beside her. Ethan appeared from the direction of the structure, reading her posture, and crossed the distance between them. She opened the letter. She read it. She read it again. "What does it say?" Ruth said. Nora looked up. She looked at her mother. She looked at Ethan. She looked back at the letter, which was brief and official, and changed everything they had thought they knew about the parcel and the patent, and what James Calloway had done in Montana Territory before coming east with nothing. The original patent filing, she said, was for 240 acres. She paused. But James Calloway filed a secondary claim the same year. Adjacent parcel, north face and the upper timber. She stopped again. The secondary claim was approved provisionally pending continuous intention of use. The land office is writing to inquire whether the Calloway estate intends to exercise that claim. She lowered the letter. Before the provisional period expires. Ruth was very still. "How much land?" she said. With the secondary claim, Nora said 390 acres. The silence in the pasture was absolute. Then Ruth made the sound again, the one from the kitchen table, the compressed syllable with everything inside it. She pressed both hands to her face. Ethan stood with his hands at his sides, and something in his eyes that was not quite something he had words for, and didn't need them. Nora looked at the letter. She looked at the land. She looked at her mother with her hands over her face on ground that was multiplying under them. "We have to exercise the claim," she said. "Obviously," Ruth said from behind her hands. "We have 30 days to file the intent." "Then we file it," Ruth said. Nora looked at Ethan. He looked back at her with the steadiness that was simply who he was. 390 acres, she said. "In Montana." "Good land," he said. "Good land," she agreed. She folded the letter. She looked out at the upper pasture, the north timber, the creek line she could hear from here, the wide reach of sky over it all. She thought about a man who had tried to build something here and failed, and come east, and spent the rest of his life trying in smaller ways and not telling people what he'd left behind. He hadn't succeeded in Montana, but he had filed. He had been here, and he had wanted something, and he had put his name on it, and his name was her name, and the wanting was still here, documented and legal and hers. She turned around. Ruth had lowered her hands. Her eyes were red. She was not going to acknowledge them. "Well," Ruth said, "we'll need a plan." "We'll need several plans," Nora said. "The structure needs assessment," Ruth said, sliding into the language of logistics the way she always did when she needed to move through the feeling. "The pasture fencing, the creek access, the timber if it's workable." She looked at Ethan. "You know this land." "I know this type of land," he said. "It would take me a few days to know this land specifically." "Then you'll need a few days," Ruth said. As though this were already decided. As though Ethan Walker staying and working this land was simply the arrangement. He looked at Nora. She looked at him. "I'd planned to stay," he said. "If that's agreeable." "It's agreeable," Ruth said, and walked back toward the structure with the folder under her arm and the posture of a woman with places to be. Nora and Ethan stood in the pasture. "She's already building it in her head," Nora said. "I know," he said. "She'll run it by herself inside 2 years." "I don't doubt it," he said. She looked at the land, all of it, the whole reach of it, more than they'd known yesterday, more than anyone had known, was there, sitting quiet and patient, and hers under a Montana sky that went on forever. She thought about the morning in Harrow Creek, when she'd held her coffee and watched Ethan Walker at the water trough through a window and wondered what kind of man talked to his horse. She thought about the pressing room in the Hargrove house and the way the air had changed when he stepped into the doorway. She thought about a dusty road north of town and a borrowed horse and the words "because someone should," and the way that had felt like a door she'd spent her whole life not knowing she was standing in front of. She had been looking at the mountains her whole life, looking at them for the quality she'd named consistency, the thing that didn't change with whoever was deciding its value. She looked at the man standing beside her. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For stopping," she said. "On that street, the first time." He held her gaze. "Thank you," he said, "for walking out of the post office at that exact moment." She almost smiled. "That's a very small thing." "Most things start small," he said. She reached out. She took his hand. He held it. They stood on Ruth Calloway's land, 390 acres of it. Montana sky above, and creek sound somewhere nearby. And 30 years of someone else's careful planting, finally broken through the surface, and the summer moved around them toward whatever came next, which was unknown and considerable, and entirely completely theirs. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be chosen. Nora Calloway had learned something different. She had learned to choose. And in choosing, she had found the one thing no one in Harrow Creek, no debt notice, no property claim, no mother's careful management of possibility, no man with a pleasant slow smile and a ledger of grievances, none of it had been able to touch. She had found ground that was hers, and a man who already knew the difference between owning something and deserving it. That was enough. That was everything.